Welcome to the California Coastal Resilience Network webinar series. My name is Kellen Warner, and I'm the facilitator for the Coastal Resilience Network, as well as a Sea Grant State Fellow for the State Coastal Conservancy. The California Coastal Resilience Network promotes knowledge exchange through webinars on climate-induced impacts on human communities and coastal habitats. We'll provide a link to the network if you'd like to join or watch past webinars, including today's, on our website. These links can be found in a follow-up email that you'll receive after today's webinar. So to go into webinar logistics, first we'll listen and watch the presentation, and they'll be followed up by a Q&A session. During the presentation, please feel free to submit questions using the Q&A box on the bottom right-hand side of the Zoom screen. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for you after today. So our presentation will introduce the basics of the public trust doctrine and a discussion of the California Coastal Commission and State Land Commission's roles in applying the doctrine, particularly as sea levels rise. So we're joined today by Karen Vu and Aubrey Yost from the California Coastal Commission and Maren Farnham from the State Lands Commission. And with that, I will pass over the virtual mic to our presenters. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks, Kellen. So I'll start us off. Thanks everyone for joining us. And as Kellen said, my name is Karen and I'm a climate change specialist at the Coastal Commission.
Hi, everyone. My name is Aubrey Yost. I am also at the Coastal Commission and in the statewide planning unit where I focus on sea level rise and housing issues. And I'll pass it off to Maren.
Hi, everyone. I'm Maren Farnham. I'm a senior environmental scientist with the State Lands Commission in our climate adaptation and special initiatives division.
All right, and we're just excited to talk to you all about public trust today. All right, so the public trust doctrine plays an extremely important role in shaping the responsibilities of both the State Lands Commission and the Coastal Commission as coastal management agencies. And because this concept is so significant in helping our agencies balance the protection of coastal resources, we wanted to give this presentation to help educate and inform how we're coordinating on the protection of the public trust in light of sea level rise. We understand that public trust can be a little bit of a complicated topic, and it's totally okay if some of you are not familiar with it. So this presentation will take you back to the roots of the public trust doctrine and how it came to be in California. And then we'll have a quick vocab lesson and discuss key terms for understanding the public trust boundary. We'll then shift our discussion to sea level rise and how it complicates management of the public trust, and how the Coastal Commission and the State Lands Commission in particular have been coordinating to better understand the impacts of sea level rise on the public trust, and how this coordination has shaped some of our work here at the Coastal Commission. And then finally, we'll go over the many products and resources that have resulted from our coordination work, including the draft Public Trust Guiding Principles and Action Plan. So the public trust doctrine has roots in ancient Roman history, where under the rule of Emperor Justinian I, this guy on the slide, a set of legal codes were compiled and included what was originally called natural common law. This law basically asserted that air, running water, sea, and seashore are all common property. This assertion of common property was further developed in English common law, which similarly states that the sovereign, currently this guy, owns all navigable waters and submerged lands as trustee for the benefit of the public. In the US, the first major application of the public trust doctrine was through the Illinois Central Railroad Company versus Illinois case presided over by the Supreme Court in this picture. This case held that the state of Illinois holds the title to the lands under the navigable waters in trust for the people of the state, that they may enjoy the navigation of the waters, carrying on commerce over them, and have liberty of fishing therein, freed from the obstruction or interference of private parties. So the key takeaway here is that, in summary, the public trust doctrine is a principle that states that certain lands are held in trust for public use or benefit, and that the government, which in our case is the state of California, and the relevant regulatory and management agencies such as the Coastal Commission and State Lands Commission, must protect and manage these lands to ensure that the public can use and enjoy them. The uses protected under the public trust have historically included activities such as navigation, commerce, and fishing. And these uses have expanded to include activities such as environmental conservation and public access via case law and statutory interpretation. So in California, the state acquired ownership over public trust lands upon its admission to the US in 1850. Since then, there have been a number of cases that have more clearly established how to interpret the public trust doctrine. Essentially, these cases have required the state to hold and protect public trust lands for the public, to consider the public's interest when making decisions that affect these lands, and to prohibit the state from disposing of the public's interest in these lands in most cases. So there is no definitive list of what is or isn't considered a public interest, also called a public trust use or resource. Instead, an analysis is done to understand the potential impact of a certain activity to public trust lands. So the analysis typically includes identifying whether the activity is connected to the water in some way or be water related or water dependent. And it also includes whether the activity or structure must serve a statewide benefit, or in other words, be a benefit to all the public. So that's why certain assets like schools or other municipal assets like police stations aren't considered public trust consistent and can't be located on public trust lands. So through case laws and previous analyses, uses or resources that are generally protected by the public trust doctrine include navigation, commerce, fishing, public access, recreation, and conservation. And then the facilities and structures that are needed to serve these public interests, such as boat docks, harbors, ports, hotels, restaurants, etc., may also be constructed and operated on public trust lands in appropriate locations. It's important to remember that the public trust doctrine isn't static. It evolves as society's needs, priorities, and values change. So as a result, all analyses on public trust consistent uses and resources are also case by case. So the lands where the public trust applies are known as sovereign lands, and they can be categorized as either ungranted or granted. Ungranted sovereign lands are lands that are currently managed by the State Lands Commission. Granted lands are not managed by the State Lands Commission. Rather, they are lands that the legislature has granted to 71 local government entities or special jurisdictions. These granted lands must still be held in trust for the public to use, but they're managed by public entities other than the state. The specific uses permitted on each granted land varies, but they can include the construction of ports, harbors, airports, and visitors serving recreational uses, as well as the creation of or protection of open space. The State Lands Commission retains residual and review authority over these granted lands. So some examples of granted lands include all of the sovereign tide and submerged lands within the city of Newport Beach, certain areas in Richardson Bay and Bolinas Lagoon in Marin County, and nearly all of San Diego Bay granted to the San Diego Unified Port District. The State Lands Commission also manages other state lands that are not part of the public trust, such as Rancho or Pueblo lands. More information on these lands can be found on the State Lands Commission's webpage called Land Types. All right, so we just talked about what the public trust doctrine is and how public trust lands can be used. Now we're going to go into where the public trust lands are. So the public trust doctrine applies to all tidelands, submerged lands, and beds of navigable waterways in the state's boundaries that California inherited when it became a state. So tidelands are situated between the ordinary high water mark and the ordinary low water mark of tidal waters. Submerged lands are between the ordinary low water mark and extends 3 miles offshore to the state federal boundary. So because tidelands are the land type that most often runs up against upland development along the coast, I'm specifically going to focus on the upper bound of this land type. So the ordinary high water mark is the same as the mean high water line or mean high tide line. This line is where the elevation of mean high water intersects the land. So the mean high water elevation is the average height of all high tides that occur over a 19-year period called the National Tidal Datum Epoch. This means that the mean high water is elevation is a single absolute number at each tide gauge statewide. So for example, if you can see in this chart here, the elevation of mean high water at the Los Angeles tide station is 4.55 feet, NAVD 88. And then just a sidebar before we keep talking about the mean high tide line. The current national tidal datum epic is from 1983 to 2001, and NOAA recalculates it about every 20 to 25 years. And NOAA expects to release a new datum epic that will span from 2002 to 2020. We understand that tidal datums can be a little bit tricky to understand, and unfortunately we don't have time to get into it today, but NOAA provides a lot more information on tidal datums on their website if you want to learn more about that. Okay, so your takeaway is that the mean high tide line is a line on the shore where a single absolute elevation that represents the average high tide over 19 years intersects the shoreline. So as we all know, the shoreline moves and shifts constantly with daily, monthly, seasonal, and interannual changes. So what does this mean for the mean high tide line? Because of the dynamic nature of a beach and all of the seasonal weather patterns, the mean high tide line can be measured at two different spots on the same beach during different seasons, as you can see in this graphic. In the summer, there are generally fewer coastal storms and less wave action. So there may be more sand that's accreted on the beach. So the mean high tide line can be located farther seaward, versus a winter beach profile where you may see an increase in storms and erosion rates. So the mean high tide line will be located farther landward. The elevation of the mean high tide line doesn't change. It's the elevation of a beach and the fluctuation of the amount of sand on a beach that causes the mean high tide line to be measured at two different locations on that beach. So often the mean high tide line represents the boundary between public lands where the public trust doctrine applies, and sometimes private uplands. So you will also hear the mean high tide line referred to as the ambulatory public trust boundary. The term ambulatory, which means able to move or walk about, is important to understanding how complex it can be to identify where the public trust doctrine applies in coastal areas. Oops. So as you can imagine, the responsibility for protecting the public trusts on California's outer coast falls upon several state and numerous local agencies. In this presentation, we're focusing specifically on the State Lands Commission and the Coastal Commission. The State Lands Commission is the land manager for all tidelands, submerged lands, and beds of navigable waterways and state school lands. They have a responsibility to manage the resources contained within them. They also issue leases for development located on ungranted public trust lands, and they monitor activity and development on granted lands. Lastly, the State Lands Commission is the recognized authority for determining the location of the ordinary high and low water mark in California. And the Coastal Commission regulates development in the coastal zone, including over public tidelands and areas that may be adjacent to these lands. So the coastal zone encompasses the mean high tide line boundary and extends between several hundred feet up to 5 miles inland along the coast and 3 miles seaward out to the state federal boundary of coastal waters. So the Coastal Commission must consider the effects that a proposed development would have on public trust resources and interests such as coastal access, habitats, and scenic values. Because the Coastal Act protects public trust interests and needs, achieving consistency with the Coastal Act or the LCP will generally address the need to protect these public trust values as well. However, there in some cases where there are specific or significant public trust concerns, a separate analysis of a project's effects on public trust lands or resources may be necessary. In all cases, though, the public trust doctrine should also inform the Coastal Commission's interpretation of the Coastal Act. So while these roles of each state agency sound simple enough, in reality, it's complicated by many factors, including the ambulatory nature of the mean high tide line, the differences in erosion rates and seasonal beach conditions, as well as maybe just a lack of available tidal measurements throughout the coast, and the existence of shoreline development, which may impede the natural ebb and flow of daily tides. These factors must also be considered in the context of various coastal development types and competing interests, which basically all contributes to the complicated task of protecting public trust lands. And now with climate change and sea level rise added to the equation, things get even more complicated, and questions about the location of the mean high tide line now and in the future are increasingly important to understand. So the Coastal Commission and State Lands Commission's authority converges at the mean high tide line. As sea level rises, the public trust boundary is migrating landward in many locations. This pattern raises a host of jurisdictional questions, data and information needs, and policy challenges, all of which require significant coordination between the Coastal Commission and the State Lands Commission, so that they are resolved in a way that maximizes the protection of public trust resources and uses. So in light of the challenges brought on by sea level rise, the Coastal Commission received a grant from NOAA to develop a 5-year work program with the State Lands Commission that aims to create a framework for protection of public trust land and resource, and to improve interagency coordination with state lands. Both agencies entered into a memorandum of understanding, or MOU, in 2019 to enhance this coordination work. And since then, a number of staff who work on sea level rise policy and planning from both agencies meet monthly to develop and review work products that aim to educate our staff and the public, which we'll explain in more detail later on. This team also coordinates quarterly calls between the Coastal Commission's district managers and various State Lands Commission staff to discuss public trust issues on specific projects and permits. So this coordination has helped inform the permitting and planning work at the Coastal Commission regarding the public trust and sea level rise. The Coastal Commission certifies LCPs, or local coastal programs. So LCPs are documents that contain policies governing development and protection of coastal resources for a specific region, often a city or county. Once an LCP is adopted by the local jurisdiction and certified by the Coastal Commission, the permitting authority is transferred to the local jurisdiction. And while each LCP reflects unique characteristics of the individual coastal community, regional and statewide interests and concerns must also be addressed in conformity with the Coastal Act goals and policies. So therefore, incorporating policies and information about public trust and LCPs is critical because, like the Coastal Commission, local governments are also responsible for protecting public trust resources. So some recently certified LCP policies related to the public trust require monitoring and mitigation for the impacts of certain shoreline protective devices where it may prevent the natural migration of public trust lands, removal of development if they will encroach on public trust lands in the future, limiting or restricting development within a certain distance from the current mean high tide line in anticipation of its migration, and requiring new leases for private development that may become located on public trust lands in the future. And then in terms of coastal development permits that the Coastal Commission issues, public trust considerations have been incorporated in staff reports for CDPs through findings and special conditions. So public trust findings typically discuss how private development can or will encroach onto public trust lands and impede public access to or use of public trust resources. And then as for special conditions and CDPs that have public trust implications, these typically include risk disclosures requiring property owners to acknowledge and agree that public trust lands may shift with rising seas, future removal conditions if the development encroaches onto public trust lands, and acknowledgement that encroachment would require a State Lands Commission lease, and permit reopeners in the form of monitoring conditions and mean high tide line surveys. And now I'm going to pass over to Aubrey.
Thanks, Karen. I'm going to talk about some of the public resources that are available and actions by the Coastal Commission relating to the public trust doctrine. The Coastal Commission and the State Lands Commission Public Trust team has for many years and continues to work on various projects to improve interagency coordination as well as education materials for agency staff and the public on the public trust and sea level rise. Next slide, please. Thanks. One of these projects is the draft Public Trust Guiding Principles and Action Plan. This document describes how the public trust doctrine relates to the Coastal Commission's work on sea level rise planning. The guiding principles in this draft document provide a set of principles to guide the Coastal Commission in its sea level rise planning work, and the action plan sets forth a suite of potential next steps and research priorities for the Commission for its work at the interface of the public trust doctrine and sea level rise planning. I'll give some examples of these in a minute. But first, a little background on how this project came to be. The Public Trust Guiding Principles and Action Plan was developed in close coordination with staff from the State Lands Commission as part of the long-term coordination project that Karen mentioned earlier. The State Lands Commission staff collaborated with Coastal Commission staff on this document and expressed their support for the draft guiding principles and action steps and their continuing role in implementing several steps as part of our ongoing coordination. This draft was presented to the Coastal Commission at the June 2022 hearing. And since that time, we conducted public comment and tribal coordination, which is now complete. And the final draft with public and tribal coordination comments incorporated will be presented to the Coastal Commission at the April 2023 hearing for the Commissioner's consideration. Next slide, please. Thanks. The guidance and action plan followed and built upon a presentation by Dr. Charles Lester of his report, Protecting Public Trust Shoreline Resources in the Face of Sea Level Rise. This was presented to the Coastal Commission in November 2021 and discusses public trust issues relating to Coastal Commission planning and regulation of development on the immediate shoreline and adjacent uplands. It also includes a variety of legal, policy, management, and technical recommendations to address public trust tidelands and sea level rise based on tideland science and the public trust doctrine. The draft Public Trust Guiding Principles and Action Plan builds on many of the recommendations in this report. The Public Trust Guiding Principles include 10 principles that are intended to assist the Coastal Commission, local governments, applicants, and the public in carrying out the Coastal Act in a way that's consistent with the public trust doctrine as sea levels rise. The Coastal Act is an exercise of the legislature's public trust authority and responsibility, and it implements aspects of the common law public trust doctrine that we've been talking about, including through its emphasis on public access, ocean-related recreation, and coastal dependent uses like ports and fishing. The guiding principles include a commitment by the Commission to consider the public trust in its decisions, a principle stating that development decisions and sea level rise will impact public trust lands, uses, and resources, a commitment to identifying anticipated impacts to current and future public tidelands, and a principle recognizing that implementation of the public trust doctrine through Coastal Commission actions can advance environmental justice, among other principles. Next slide, please. Thanks. The action plan presents a series of next steps and research and policy questions relating to sea level rise and the public trust that the Coastal Commission hopes to prioritize over the next 5 years as staff resources and funding allow. These action steps build on the recommendations from Dr. Lester's report and our staff's work with the State Lands Commission over the past several years. So here's a few examples of these next steps. One action step is to consider updates to Commission regulations relating to mitigation of the adverse effects of sea level rise on public trust lands. Some of the other action steps range from interagency and tribal coordination to public outreach, engagement, and public education on the purpose and role of the public trust doctrine and the management of California's lands and natural resources. Another action step is to identify development decisions such as boundary line agreements that result in coastal squeeze, leading to the loss of public trust resources. And another next step is to work with the State Lands Commission to create a GIS inventory of public trust tidelands. More discussion of each of these guiding principles and next steps is included in the document that's on the Commission's website. If adopted, the guiding principles will guide Coastal Commission decisions on development and LCP certification that may impact public trust resources, uses, or lands in the foreseeable future due to sea level rise. So similar to the Coastal Commission's sea level rise guidance for projects with sea level rise issues, the guidance will provide information about the public trust and how it relates to sea level rise and the Commission's work, and be incorporated into the Commission's decisions. For example, the guiding principles discuss how certain coastal resources could be impacted by the loss of public trust lands, such as public access, recreational resources, scenic and visual resources, and environmentally sensitive habitat areas. I'll talk a little bit about the variety of public resources related to the public trust that the Coastal Commission and State Lands Commission both have on their website. The Coastal Commission has a public trust webpage found under the main header Learn on the Commission's website. And that currently features the draft guiding principles and action plan that we've been talking about, a fact sheet on the public trust doctrine, and the Coastal Commission and State Lands Commission's roles in implementing the doctrine. The hearing presentation on the public trust report and recommendation by Dr. Charles Lester, and more information via story map that gives an accessible overview of the public trust doctrine and sea level rise. The State Lands webpage also has other information, such as a detailed description of public trust land types. And another great resource that the State Lands Commission has is their OSCAR portal. OSCAR stands for Online System for Customer Applications and Records, and it's a great place for people to apply for a State Lands Commission lease or submit inquiry to determine the public trust status of a land area. I'm going to give a quick preview of one of these resources that I mentioned. So this is our public trust story map on the Coastal Commission's website. It's a great visual resource that explains the public trust doctrine in simple, kind of easier to understand language. It breaks down a lot of the concepts we've learned today, like what it means for the state of California to own and trust public trust lands. And it also has a lot of pictures of public trust tidelands and resources to help people visualize what public trust lands include and why they're so important. So I'd encourage you to check this resource out on the Coastal Commission's website, and I will put a link to this resource in the chat after our presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Sorry about
Sorry,
that. Karen, we have one last slide.
Okay, I thought you did. And I was like, I don't know if I'm jumping in yet. No, you're good.
No, sorry. I had a tech snafu. So to wrap up, I want to reiterate some of the key points from this presentation. First, we hope you walk away understanding what the public trust doctrine and public trust uses and resources are. We also hope that you gain a better understanding of coastal boundaries and how to identify where public trust lands are generally located along the coast. And lastly, while sea level rise raises a whole host of new questions regarding the protection of the public trust in the future, we continue to work closely with the State Lands Commission to help answer some of these questions and create resources to address public trust issues. So we hope you now know that the Coastal Commission and State Lands Commission have publicly available resources that can explain these concepts and some of the action steps both agencies are working on. So thanks so much for joining us, and we can now open up the meeting for any questions.
There we go. Sorry, I jumped the gun there. Thank you so much for that presentation. It was wonderful. And I really appreciate everyone's been asking a lot of questions in the Q&A box. And I know Marin's already been answering some as well. I'll start with one that someone asked that said, how can the public trust doctrine be used to promote environmental preservation?
I can start with an answer, and Karen and Marin, please feel free to jump on as you would like. The public trust doctrine sets aside certain lands, like tidelands, for instance, for the public's use. And one of those public trust uses does include preservation of habitats. So that is something that the Coastal Commission does think about, and that is kind of incorporated in the public trust doctrine. So I think the public trust doctrine plays a really important role in environmental preservation, especially as sea levels rise, and we have to start thinking about the impacts of sea level rise on habitats, especially where there's development that prevents the public trust tidelands from moving inland and prevents habitats from also migrating inland.
Thanks, Javi. I'll just add as well that there are other agencies also that are responsible for the management of the public trust, and we coordinate with them, and we also have agreements with them. So for instance, California State Parks has several leases with the State Lands Commission for coastal and marine state parks for the tidelands and submerged lands that fall into those places. And so they are the active managers of spaces like that are also critically important to maintaining and enhancing important coastal habitats and ecosystems.
Awesome, thanks. All right, we have a lot of questions about the San Diego Bay. I live in San Diego, so I like learning more about it too. So a question someone asked is, does MHTL analysis apply to inside the San Diego Bay tidelands, which is almost all of it?
I don't totally understand the question, but I'll try to just kind of give maybe a brief overview that might help understand the area a bit more. So just like with all areas of the coast, when different activities have taken place along the shoreline, there are generally mean high tide line surveys that are performed in those specific locations. This is an ambulatory boundary, and that's why it changes all the time, it shifts all the time. So you could survey the mean high tide line at one time of year and it will be completely different at a different time of year. That happens less so in bays, actually. They tend to stabilize a little bit more. But there's also been a tremendous amount of development over the years within the bays, and that can change the location of the mean high tide line as well. So when the legislature grants the management of state lands to a local entity within the San Diego Bay, there's the Port of San Diego, but also within San Diego County, there are other grants to the City of San Diego in the Mission Bay area, City of Oceanside, further up north in the county. They and the State Lands Commission will be the record holders of those mean high tide line surveys. And the boundary is determined through a process of gathering a lot of different threads of evidence, including those mean high tide line surveys, as well as looking through old records of tideland patents and records and things like that to determine where that boundary is. So it's a complicated area. There's a lot of different overlapping jurisdictions. And if you're interested in learning more about where the boundary might be in a certain location, we definitely encourage you to use that OSCAR system that Karen and Aubrey mentioned earlier. And we have a link to the slide. I can throw another link to the chat. And if it's an area within a grant and State Lands doesn't have the information available, we will direct you to those local governing agencies that can help you with the determination of the land status there.
Great, thank you. That was nice and thorough, but comprehensive. All right, another question that's a little more broad is what are the considerations and what is the process for determining a new public trust use?
I can start with this. We touched on this a little bit in the presentation, but we basically determine whether a structure or an activity is a public trust use or resource, basically by defining whether it's water related or water dependent. So it has to be located on the shoreline, and then whether what kind of benefit does it serve? Does it serve a benefit to all of the public? Does it serve to benefit only a certain portion of the public? So that's where we start our evaluation of whether something is a public trust use. So yeah, Maren, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, that's great. There's, it's a very broad doctrine. Like Karen says, it definitely starts with water dependent, water reliant. That connection needs to be made. But the way that we've seen it evolve and change over time has also been sort of confirmed by case law and different court decisions, as Karen also mentioned earlier in the presentation. So it sort of evolves. Sometimes there's a critical mass of interest in a particular use, and analyses might show that that particular use is consistent with the public trust, but often it's not sort of legally solid or sound until the courts, some sort of case goes through the courts to adjudicate it.
Great, and kind of to go along with that, what happens to the public trust when it intersects a seawall or other structure?
That's a great question, and one that is somewhat unsettled legally still, but there is decisions by courts that are kind of relevant to this question, which suggest that a shoreline protective device like a seawall can't unilaterally stop the public trust boundary from moving inland. So as sea levels rise, like Karen was talking about during the presentation, the public trust boundary and the mean high tide line in most areas is kind of unilaterally over time moving inland. And so when it hits those shoreline protective devices that are meant to protect private development, in many cases, it may be that because this it fixes the ambulatory mean high or public trust boundary, that shoreline protective device, even though it might physically stop the mean high tide line from moving inland, it doesn't stop the public trust boundary from moving inland. Again, that's a little bit of an unsettled question, but that is the way that at least the Ninth Circuit has looked at structures like seawalls and the ambulatory boundary of the public trust.
And along that line of hard structures, or what I can't remember the phrase you said, but it was beautiful in legalese, but seawalls, how is there work being done to prevent more of those or disincentivizing those being built, or is that continuing to be a method for dealing with sea level rise that is being advocated by the SLC and the CCC?
Yeah, it's a complicated question. So there are certain circumstances where under the Coastal Act, which is the Coastal Commission's guiding legislation, that shoreline protective devices are allowed. So for places like existing development or coastal dependent uses. But the Coastal Commission has really been encouraging, first and foremost, for people to look at other solutions to sea level rise, like nature-based adaptation solutions that don't have those kinds of negative impacts on ecosystems and public trust lands and uses. So there might be some cases where armoring is permitted, but we are definitely encouraging looking at other ways to adapt to sea level rise. And then in many other places where armoring's not allowed, those nature-based adaptation solutions become even more important. So.
Yeah, and I would just add on that it is a balance. The public trust doctrine, it doesn't prioritize a singular use over another. So we have to look at everything on a case-by-case basis. And there are certain uses that depend on hard armoring structures or conventional structures to facilitate that water-dependent use, like a port or a harbor district, or maybe critical infrastructure, utilities, roadways. So it's complicated because there are many uses that you could, that could be appropriate and applicable in a certain place. But like Aubrey said, we're working together in this public trust coordination project. We're working together on a number of deliverables to really investigate the impacts on public trust lands that these conventional structures can have, and then come up with different ways to incentivize and encourage the use of many other different strategies, including nature-based strategies, but some places are really space limited, and those aren't always the best. Sometimes the best strategy is to avoid an area altogether for development, or to employ the use, working with local governments on local planning documents like setbacks and other types of strategies. Or there's a lot of really interesting work, thinking about accommodation strategies, which are, kind of can sometimes be hybrid between these two, but can employ kind of different methods for sort of working with the water. And so, and I just wanted to mention too that we have many local partners in this, many local communities, local governments, local port and harbor districts. And so to encourage folks to also help us, kind of find those place-based strategies that are best for these individual locations.
Yeah, it is complicated, and it's more complicated than yes, seawall, no seawall, yes, and it's so dependent on where you are and who's there. So thank you for that answer. I think it's important for us to think about all those things.
I'll
Yeah.
just tack on one more thing, to
Yeah.
mention that the majority of the applications, or the majority of the leases that we have are for existing structures.
Mm.
So I just wanted to note that, at least for the State Lands Commission, we are not, we're not seeing currently a huge proliferation of applications to install new structures that are conventional, but we really want to kind of get out in front of this issue, because we anticipate that with sea level rise and other impacts that are in this zone, that shoreline protection is going to become even more desired by an even greater number of properties that are adjacent to the shoreline than before, as these pressures increase. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that in case people are wondering sort of what sort of the current, sort of lay of the land is in terms of what types of applications we receive.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good question, or a good clarification. I had this question a couple times, so I want to be sure we address it. Can private development qualify for a lease for a location that has come within the public trust?
Sorry, Kelly, can you repeat that one more time?
Yes, and I think someone said it a different way, so I can say that one too. Can private development qualify for a lease for a location that has come within the public trust?
So most lease applicants are well, I think I understand the question. We 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 strive not to lease public lands for solely private uses. That said, sometimes it can be complicated because a lessee might be a private property owner, but the project that they've applied for a lease for that might span a small part of state lands and the upland jurisdiction. It may also have some kind of public benefit or some type of public function. There are uses that can have sort of private and public functions. And there are some structures that I think what this question might be alluding to, and we talk about this a lot in our project, that they may not have been located on state lands when they were first constructed, but as time goes on, they are, as that mean high tide line boundary moves inland, they may already be or may soon to be on state lands. And it's a balancing act. So there's going to be regulations applied from the Coastal Commission that apply to those projects. And as far as state lands goes, we are generally going to look at those projects closely and make a determination about whether or not there can be consistencies with the public trust, or what types of augmentations or changes could be made that will ensure that a structure or use that is located on state lands in present day is consistent with the trust at that location.
And piggybacking off of that, another question along the same vein is there some kind of lifetime or a way to address coastal development that is currently not in public trust areas, but as sea level rise happens, we think it might interfere so that private land isn't taking over the private trust regions. Does that make sense? I can restate it and just say what the person typed. How can we put a lifetime on privatized coastal development so it doesn't de facto take over the public trust as public tidelands move inland due to sea level rise?
So that is a question that we're currently grappling with. We don't have a one size fits all solution for that, nor do I think, there is a one size fits all solution for the whole state. But what we've done in the past is based on our analysis and current high tide line surveys that have been conducted for around that development, we'll place conditions on the permit requiring mean high tide line monitoring surveys to be conducted at certain times throughout the year. We'll also include permit reopeners in the form of, like, in case the mean high tide line gets within a certain distance to the structure, requiring the applicant to come in for a follow-up permit.
And just to add on to those special conditions, another special condition that the commission sometimes imposes is removal of structures and development if they become located on public trust lands, and they and so at that point they need to get a lease from the State Lands Commission, and they need another CDP from the Coastal Commission, or they would have to be removed. I don't know, Maren, if you have any other thoughts you want to add to that?
Well, for State Lands Commission leases, they are for a finite period of time. So each lease has a lease term attached to it of a certain amount of years. And every lease contains the general provision that at the end of that lease term, the lessee may be required to restore the state lands that the improvements were on to its natural condition, or its previous state. And so that doesn't really apply. I think Coastal Commission is the one with the regulatory authority over a larger sort of geographic area that would include maybe some of those private developments that the questioner was asking about that aren't currently on state lands. But once something is located on state lands, and the commission does have jurisdiction if it's in an ungranted area, those are the standard conditions that would apply to a lease. So it is time limited.
Great. All right, switching gears a little bit, I like this question. What is the Coastal Commission's approach to environmental justice? Is it pushing for more built structures in the form of low-cost accommodations, or are there other initiatives as well?
So I think that's a really great question. That's something that we are exploring with, we have a grant from NOAA to kind of explore a policy guidance that will kind of intersect environmental justice with sea level rise. And so throughout that project, public trust will also be kind of, a big guiding principle for how we develop those sorts of policies. So it's not just looking at lower cost accommodations. It's also looking at public access in the forms of, free public access or lower cost parking, all that sort of thing. So.
Great, there's so many questions. This is very fun. Okay, so what's the approach for the Coastal Commission approving LCPs, particularly in areas where it seems that the government is maybe hesitant to include managed retreat?
Can you repeat that question?
Yeah. Is the Coastal Commission approving LCPs in areas where local governments aren't including managed retreat within their LCP, or is that mandatory for approving an LCP?
That's a good question. Managed retreat is not a requirement. Our approach right now is to kind of push for sort of baseline policies that address sea level rise and protection of the public trust. Certainly, we encourage local jurisdictions to look at managed retreat and whether that is an option that is viable and feasible for their local jurisdiction. So it's not a requirement, but it's something that we certainly encourage if other sea level rise adaptation strategies may not be as feasible for the area.
And how does the State Lands Commission and the Coastal Commission monitor and enforce provisions of LCPs and coastal development permits they issue when they've approved major new projects along the coast?
I can start with this one too. So in terms of monitoring permits that are approved at the local level, once a jurisdiction has a certified LCP, that usually comes to us on appeals if there's just a member of the public or someone who appeals that decision to the Coastal Commission. The Coastal Commission also is notified of how local coastal development permits are processed. The local jurisdiction is required to send their sort of decision on coastal development permits to the Coastal Commission. Those are usually called final local action notices. So those are kind of the two main ways that the commission stays on top of what's being permitted at the local level. And in terms of how State Lands and the Coastal Commission are trying to coordinate on this, that's actually a question that has been raised to the kind of the sea level rise group between both agencies, is how can we better coordinate when we are looking at LCPs that may have policies that address public trust. So we're continuing coordination on that.
A follow-up question is, if there is an approved LCP, there's no necessity under the law to update it. Is that correct?
Yeah, and Aubrey, you may correct me, but as far as I'm aware, there is no sort of mandate to update the LCP once it's approved. Is that correct?
I think that's right. And there's not any penalties if you don't, but the Coastal Commission absolutely encourages local governments to update their LCPs as conditions change, especially with sea level rise. Some policies that might have made sense years or decades ago aren't going to make sense as sea levels rise. So even if there's not a some kind of like legal penalty, there might be kind of practical negative impacts of not updating your LCP. So we definitely encourage local governments to update their LCPs regularly.
All right, I think we have time for one more. This is from the chat, not from the Q&A box. So excellent presentation. It seems that there is debate about whether the trust lands end at SPDs or extend through them. Any guidance on that part? Sorry for my dog whining in the background.
You're good. So we touched on this a little bit, and I know we're getting short on time, but I will just put a plug in for the draft public trust guiding principles and action plan. There is a guiding principle number 9 in that draft, which is available on the Commission's website, that talks specifically about this question. So if you want more detail, go there. I'll drop that in the chat before we head out. But yeah, there is some debate, and I think we think that in some circumstances, it might be appropriate to consider where the public trust boundary would be if not for a shoreline protective device or some other kind of armoring that kind of physically stops the mean high tide line from moving inland over time with sea level rise. There may be circumstances where the Coastal Commission needs to look at where the public trust boundary would have been if the shoreline protective device was not there. The Coastal Commission makes decisions on a case-by-case basis, but those circumstances could arise.
And I'll just quickly add that the practice of determining where the mean high tide line is a technical practice set forth by technical standards for by national and international standards for water boundary surveying. So it's not a though we do a case-by-case and site analysis for every project or lease application or coastal development permit application for Coastal Commission, the survey and determination of that boundary is a practice that we don't set we're not the ones sort of setting a law or standards around that practice of how those measurements are taken. We do recognize that shoreline protective devices can exert an artificial influence over where the mean high tide line is. And Aubrey said we're exploring ways to, using all these new technologies like LiDAR data and GIS to think about the future and how it's going to be affected by sea level rise. But it's a very complicated issue, and it hasn't been settled by the courts, this exact question. But we're all interested in it. And in the meantime, that's why our coordination and collaboration is so important. Because sometimes there's not a neat and clean legal definition, but it doesn't mean that we can't still take meaningful actions that help protect and adapt public trust lands and resources.
That is a great note to end on. Thank you all so much for joining today. Thanks for all the incredible questions. Our presenters answered 18, which I think might be a record for a CRN webinar, so thank you. You'll receive an email later this week with a link to the recording for today. And a big thank you again to our presenters and to everyone else. Take care and have a great week.
Thank you.
Thank you
everyone.
so much.
So